Michael Ellman. It's my privilege to serve as the first president of CJE. It's my privilege also to welcome each and every one of you to the first of what we hope will be an exciting inaugural series. Depends how this goes if we're going to continue with this.
First of many.
First of many. And I have to tell you that this is an extraordinary event because it came about in a very short period of time. The idea had been around for a long time, but to take an idea and to turn it into something tangible, it takes a lot of hard work. It takes really the right type of leadership. So I was very fortunate and blessed to have as our chairperson, Rena Janet, who I will tell you a little bit about in a moment. But it starts at the top, and Rena's at the top as our incoming chairman of the board, Linda Hurwitz, and with a very, very dedicated committee whose names can be found inside of your booklet. And everyone worked very hard to design this program, and that's why we're here tonight. So Rena is an immediate past president of Associated Women. She devotes much of her volunteer time to the Associated, where she most recently served as the president of Associated Women. She was the Women's 2012 Annual Campaign Chair. She was the founding chair of Chapter 2 and was instrumental in the development of program concept and curriculum. Rena's also served in a variety of positions within the organized Jewish community, including chairman of Women's Division of Israel Bonds in Maryland, president of Lovendale Auxiliary, and co-chairman of the Mitzvah 613 Year-Long Project of Learning and activities centered around the writing of the first Torah written specifically for Beth El congregation. She's not writing it herself, though.
No.
Okay. Currently, Rena is deputy general chairman of Israel Bonds, Maryland, and Rena and her husband Howard have wonderful children, Andrew 28 and Adam 26, who are both attorneys, and a lovely daughter-in-law, Corinne Janet. Rena was active in the Gilman School when her sons were there, having served as a member of the Board of Trustees and president of the Parents Association. Rena graduated from the University of Maryland with a BS in journalism, concentrating in public relations. That's why you're all here. She enjoyed a career in advertising before starting a family. Rena values the time she spends volunteering and feels that the friendships she gains along the way make the work, in quotes, doubly rewarding. So the adage is, if you want to be successful, you find somebody who's very busy, because that person will always say, I don't have any time, but we'll take it on anyhow. And you see there's a lot on her plate, but yet she put a labor of love into this, and we are eternally grateful for everything you did, because this would not have happened without your leadership. So thank you, Rena.
Way too much information as far as I'm concerned.
I just read what they read.
I'll have to speak to somebody else then. The truth is that this is Michael, we're just going to give compliments back and forth. This is Michael Ellman's baby. Michael became president of CJE, and he said to himself, and he's saying to all of us, that leaders need to learn. You need to mimic the behavior that you want and you expect from your community. Michael said, we're going to take on this project. And he spoke to the leaders of the Associated. They were in, and we really developed this program where it's offered to any member of the Associated organizational family, agency boards, synagogue boards, and friends and relatives. We have a couple people who brought their family members, and we're just very pleased that you could all be here this evening. But I do have to give a lot of kudos to Michael and to his and to Linda Hurwitz also, who was at the meeting when Michael said, Rena, would you do this for us? And we said yes. We're happy to do it. This is the first of a three-part series. These three sessions are going to be around Pesach. All will have something to do with Pesach in some way, and we hope that at the end you'll be able to take something that you've learned, something that you've shared, some thought that you have, and enhance your Seder, which is coming before we know it. I've seen the food on the shelf with the giant. 7 Mile has not caught up yet, but we're getting there. It's very, very close. Okay. There are many members, Michael had mentioned that there was a steering committee. Many of you are here this evening, and rather than take the time, this is on the back of your card, you'll see everybody listed. So you may be sitting with somebody who was part of the steering committee. Much of it, because it was kind of a expedited process, was done with conference calls, and we got it all done, and it worked out really well. So I thank the entire steering committee who helped out. Tonight's session is on Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves. We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. And what can we really learn about going from servitude to freedom? Our next session will be with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, and it will be the future of the Jewish past, the meanings and consequences of Jewish memory. That's March 15th at noon, also right in this room. The last session will be with Michael Brooks. He was the head of Hillel at the University of Michigan, if anybody was there or your kids were there. And he will be speaking about the four sons of the Haggadah. The final session will also include a celebratory see-you. So we hope we will see you at all three sessions. If you can come to a second session and not a third, that would be great. But you're invited, and you're invited to bring a friend, a family member, anybody that you think would enjoy the program. In your folders tonight, besides the text that we're going to study tonight and the study sheets, you will see a blank paper we're going to call it a reflection sheet. And what we would like you to do is throughout the evening, make notes on the reflection sheet. It could be from conversation, it could be a thought that you might have, it could be something you're learning. And at the end of the evening, we would either like you to turn it in, or if you want to go home and think about it, email it to us later on the next couple of days. And we plan to take all of the notes we receive and compile them into a booklet. So at the end of the three sessions, you will have a wonderful booklet of people's thoughts who are interested in learning the same things you're interested in learning about as a resource for your saving. Amian, where's Amian? Yeah, I'll introduce Larry in a minute, who's going to be our instructor this evening. But Amian Kellner, Amian was with CJE, and she helped put the entire program together. Has provided a library for us right here. If you want to look at it when the evening's over or during the session. Amian and her staff at CJE really helped this process move quickly and smoothly. So we thank you for all of your help. Our presenter this evening is Larry Ziffer, and probably many of you know Larry. He is the CEO of the Louise D. and Morton J. Mack Center for Jewish Education. In addition, for the past 10 years, he's been the Jewish educator for Acharai, and he currently teaches the Leadership 2.0 Melton curriculum for lay and professional agency leaders. I will add that Larry is being honored by Acharai on May 16th for his 10 years of service to the Acharai program. So, Larry, we're ready to learn. Come get us started.
Thank you, Rena. So just to add a couple of organizational notes here, each of these three sessions is going to be both videotaped and audio taped, so if you'd like to go back and listen afterwards, or if you know somebody who wasn't able to come, we will be sending you the link. In addition to sending you the link, we're going to be sending you the link online as to where you can put your reflections. So it's your choice. If you choose to leave your reflection sheet with us here tonight, put your name on it. We promise to get it back to you. If you choose to take it home and work on it a little bit more, we'll give you a link tomorrow that will enable you to go online and fill out some of those reflections. And as Rena said,
I have a question. Is it okay if people have a reflection and they don't want to sign their page? Can they turn in an anonymous reflection?
Sure, absolutely. But if you would like your reflection page back, we'll be happy to get it back to you. So either way is fine. And you'll see the reflection page in there has some guided questions which will pretty much follow the pattern of what we're discussing tonight. And there's also some blank paper for you to take other notes as well. Before we get started, as Rena said, our topic tonight is Avadim Hayinu, which is a significant section of the Haggadah which follows the four questions that the youngest child asks. Before we get started with the text that we're going to look at, I'd like you to watch something because this is 21st century. We want to see something that's modern and contemporary. But here's the thing. You're going to have to watch fast Okay, this goes very quickly. It's a sign of the times. But I want you to get a sense of how contemporary the Passover story can be. So the reason that I shared that with you is because I think that the messages of Pesach, Passover, are so consistent, so timeless, that we want to take a look tonight at some text and see what some lessons are that we can gain from our tradition and see how they apply to us today. And I think you'll find that the lessons that are embedded in the text are very, very current and contemporary. So, first question, how did you study Torah? How do we study Torah? And we're going to divert our attention for a minute from the text of the Haggadah, and we're going to take a look at why we're here tonight and what we want to accomplish. First of all, is studying Torah a mitzvah?
Yes.
How would you categorize the idea of studying Torah? If you think it's a mitzvah, how would you know?
You have to read it in the Torah.
What's that?
You have to read it in the Torah.
You have to read it in the Torah. So you have to know what the source is. How would you know where to go to find out a source for anything that you want to know, if it's something that's a custom or if it's really a mitzvah? A mitzvah means that it falls within the greater context of things that are literally commanded for us as Jews. So one of the first places you might go is to Maimonides, otherwise known as the Rambam. His name Rambam is a contraction of Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. So the first letters of each of those words are Rabbi Moshe, son of Maimon. That is where we get the name Rambam. It's an abbreviation, but he's also known as Maimonides, which is not a Hebrew way of speaking about his name, but that's the way he's known in the secular world of philosophy. He was born in Cordoba, Spain, in the 1130s, and he moved to Morocco briefly when the golden age of Spain came to an end, which was in 1148. And Jews were threatened with death if they did not convert to Islam. So some of the things that we see today in our world are not brand new. Things tend to cycle. But there was a golden age in Spain, and he lived at the end of that time when Jewish scholarship, Jewish life flourished in Spain and in portions of the Islamic world. In 1168, he and his family settled in Egypt, where he remained for the rest of his life. He was a Torah scholar, he was a philosopher, a doctor, a court physician to the Grand Vizier, an advisor to the Sultan. He died in 1204 in Fostat, Egypt, and his remains are buried in Tiberias, Israel. Many of us have been to Tiberias and had the opportunity to visit his tomb there. The Rambam wrote a number of very important books and treatises. One of them is called the Sefer HaMitzvot, Book of Commandments, which builds upon a tradition in Jewish life that the Talmud tells us that there are 613 mitzvot altogether, 248 of which are positive commandments, and 365 are negative commandments. There's an interesting mnemonic or memory tool about that. 365, the number of days in the solar year. 248 is supposedly the number of sinews in the body, different organs and sinews all together in the body. So we see that those match up. If you put them all together, you have a combination of person and time, which is all of what we're about. Rambam is perhaps the most universally accepted authority on these 613 commandments. The tradition that there is such a thing as 613 commandments is mentioned in the Talmud, but the Talmud doesn't tell us what they are. And so rabbis during the ages figured out what the possible 613 would be. There are commentaries on the Rambam, and there are commentaries on the commentaries on the Rambam, which we call super commentaries. So it's something has a lot of interest. So take a look at the source sheet in your packet, which says, "Why do Jews study Torah?" And you'll see. I'll follow the English, but anybody who wants to follow the Hebrew is welcome to do that as well. You'll see that it says, Maimonides Rambam, the Book of Mitzvot, the positive commandments. Now, I could have brought you all 248, but I decided to just bring you down to the first 11. And you'll see that the number 11 is to study Torah and to teach it to others. As the Torah says in Deuteronomy 6:2, and you shall teach them to your children. Anybody know what that source is? And you shall teach them to your children? That's the Shema, the Shinantam Livanecha. So it's very interesting because it seems that the mitzvah to study Torah emanates from the mitzvah to teach Torah. In fact, according to the Rambam, not everybody, but according to the Rambam, it's one and the same mitzvah. Now, wouldn't you have expected the Rambam to find some other verse as a source for the mitzvah to study Torah? Why do you think he derived it from the mitzvah to teach Torah?
I think that when you teach something, that means that you know it very well. So you can study it for personal interest, but you don't understand it as well unless you have to teach it or give it over to someone.
Very good. Any other thoughts? Any other reactions?
That's not for Buddha.
Well, you can't teach something unless you studied it, so you can't do the mitzvah until you've learned it first.
Good. Yes?
And you can't teach something unless there's someone to learn from you.
So you're setting up a chain,
It's a
right? You're part of a chain of tradition.
Well, it's not a chain, it's more like a circle.
A circle, okay. Okay, so the Shinantam Livanecha, teach your children, presumes that somebody taught you, and you'll teach it on, and we might call it teach it forward, right? A variation of pay it forward. So everybody has to learn it. Very good. So we see that the Shinantam Livanecha is the source of learning Torah. It's very interesting, by the way, that this also implies that we have to be role models. Children are very, very perceptive, more so than we usually think. I didn't realize it so much when I had my children. I see it much more now with my grandchildren. So I think that we sometimes, because we're so busy and because we're so preoccupied, we don't understand how perceptive our children are. But if a child thinks that you are subjugating him or her to something that's not really important to you, then it's not going to be important to them either. It might be for a short while they have a momentary interest, but the real way to interest children is to show your own interest. It's very interesting. I quoted this so many times. Ron Wolfson is very fond of saying that when you get onto an airplane and they go through the whole orientation, and the steward or the stewardess says to you, or it might be on the video, and it says that if there's a drop in cabin pressure, oxygen masks will come down. If you're traveling with a small child, please put your oxygen mask on first and then take care of your child, right? Now that goes totally counter to a Jewish mother's instinct, right? There's danger. What are you going to do first before anything else? Take care of the kids. What does this teach us? What can we derive from this example, this model?
You don't take care of yourself first, you can't help others.
If you don't take care of yourself, you're not much use to somebody else. And children are very resilient. So the model here, what Ron Wolfson is teaching us is, just like on the airplane, where you have to take your oxygen first, if anybody thinks that they are going to indoctrinate or pass on our traditions to the next generation with drop-off Judaism, you know what drop-off Judaism is? You know, we drop off the kids here, we drop them off there. Hebrew school's not fun. And sometimes day school's not fun either. And if children know that their parents are interested, and if they even know, especially, that their parents are also studying in some way, that's going to reinforce the Jewish experience that they're having. So everybody knows that most learning takes place in a teaching environment. And most of that learning takes place in a typical teacher-student interactive relationship. In most situations, the teacher is active and the student is passive. That's the usual way. However, going all the way back to the time of the Mishnah, which is around 200 of the Common Era, we know that the rabbis established a form of learning known as chavrusa or chavruta. Ashkenazic pronunciation would be chavrusa. That's the way it's said in most yeshivas. And chavruta is the more modern Sephardic pronunciation. The term literally means companionship or partnership. But it's also come to, now come to be used to describe each of the individuals in a pair. So you would say that I'm studying tonight with my chavruta. Unlike a teacher-student relationship in which the student usually memorizes and repeats the material back in tests, chavruta-style learning puts each student in the position of analyzing the text, organizing one's thoughts into logical arguments, explaining your reasoning to your partner, hearing out the partner's arguments and reasoning, questioning and sharpening each other's ideas, and often arriving at entirely new insights into the meaning of the text. So typically in a Beit Midrash, which is a Jewish study hall, the environment begins to buzz and eventually roar with the discussion that's going on, where people are discussing, arguing, persuading, and achieving consensus among the chavruta pairs. So we're going to experiment a little bit with that tonight. What I'd like you to do is look at the bottom part of your sheet, Why Did You Study Torah? And you see here a section from another book of the Rambam called the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam took an extraordinary leap of mastery. His mind was clearly computer-like. He had total recall. He knew everything there was to know in his time, just about. In addition to knowing secular knowledge, philosophy, medicine, he certainly knew the entire written Torah and oral Torah. Now let me just make a quick aside on what we mean when we say written Torah and oral Torah. The tradition says that when Moses was on Mount Sinai and he received the Torah, he received really two traditions. One was the written Torah, which we have. We typically have it in a scroll or maybe in a published book. And there was also an oral tradition that expanded upon that. How do we know that? Because we know we have certain traditions that explain things that are not written in the Torah. My favorite example is, we all know that the Torah says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is the way Bible-thumping Christians usually refer to, the God of anger, the God of the Old Testament, right? But the Talmud tells us, the oral tradition tells us, that's not what it means at all. And to go into a further discussion about this is a little bit beyond our scope for tonight. But it means that if you poke out somebody's eye, it's not justice that you have your eye poked out, it's justice that you provide monetary compensation in 5 different categories of how this person has suffered. For the damage, for the loss of work, for embarrassment, for the medical costs. All of these are the way we interpret that verse. And there are many other verses in the Torah that we would not know how to interpret if we didn't have this oral tradition. So let me ask you a question. You've all played the game of telephone. What happens as an oral tradition is passed on from generation to generation? It changes, it grows, it expands. Everybody has different interpretations of what they were talking about. So it was getting out of hand. So around the year 200 of the Common Era, Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, decided it was time to take a bold step and to write down the oral tradition. And he wrote it down in something that's known as the Mishnah. So when you hear the term Mishnah, it's the oral tradition written down. But it was written in such a way that it was a framework. It was like having Cliff Notes. And if you know Cliff Notes, they might help you pass the test. but they aren't a substitute for reading the book, right? And so the rabbis over the next 300 years had conversations about what the Mishnah means. And all of those discussions were copied down almost as a transcript of the discussions, and that's known as the Gemara. All right? And if you put the Mishnah and the Gemara together, that's what we call Talmud. So when we talk about the rabbinic tradition, we're talking about the Talmud. We mean the oral tradition written down as it evolved over that total period of time. Now, lest you think that everything ended in the year 500 when the Talmud was canonized and sealed, obviously for the next 1,000, 2,000 years, 1,500 years, the Talmud has continued to be interpreted in every generation. Along came the Rambam in the 1100s, and he said, for the average person, this is just too hard. So what I'm going to do, and the Talmud is kind of stream of consciousness, right? If you learn Talmud for the first time, you would say the rabbis were totally ADD, right? That's because it goes from one topic to another, stream of consciousness. So the Rambam said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take everything in the oral tradition, and I'm going to organize it into 14 books, according to 14 different categories. And he did it. He did it without the help of a computer. He did it without the help of any other compendium. He created the first such compendium. And he took it upon himself basically to say, you don't have to study Talmud anymore, just study my book, and you'll know the oral law. That was very controversial. So today people study the Talmud, and they study the Rambam. But whenever we want to know what the halacha is, what the law is, or how we trace it back, the Rambam is the first place that we go. So what I want you to do is take a look. This is from the Sefer Mada, which is the book of knowledge, the laws of Talmud Torah, which means the laws of studying Torah. And you have these two halachot, these two sections there, number 3 and number 4, which talk about the responsibility for studying Torah. And I've highlighted sections that I would like you to discuss with your partner, but you can always go back and fill in the parts that are not highlighted if you'd like. What I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, read these 4 different selections, B and C under 3 and A and B under 4, and I'd like to ask yourselves, what is the underlying assumption of the parent-child relationship when it comes to studying Torah? We've already discussed it a little bit. I'd like you to take a look at it here and see how Maimonides, how the Rambam develops it. So we'll do that for a few minutes. If you would like to move around, we've set up the tables so that hopefully people can sit next to each other, across from each other, and do this. It's going to get a little bit loud, and that might be distracting for some people, but we hope that you'll be able to follow it. And there are some extra chairs on the side if somebody wants to take a couple of chairs and go to the side or the back of the room, and we'll start. Yeah.
That was not assigned anyone back from the floor.
If you have a partner, you study with your partner. If you don't, then you can team up with another couple, another pair, and you can do it in threes.
I don't want to.
No, we
Go to Nate.
So remember, you're going to be looking at the parent-child relationship as it's reflected in the text.
Everyone have a yourself.
It was a good start. It was a little quiet, frankly, but you'll have another chance.
He gets the resources.
So, I haven't heard any arguing yet. I've heard only discussion. But we'll see if we can get into some arguments later on. Any observations? We've taken the mitzvah and we fleshed out a little bit. What can you tell me about the relationship between parent and child?
That's right. It should be the opposite.
You have to model the behavior for your children, yet if they're at a different level or plane than you are in your own, you have to provide a teacher or challenge, for them to continue to grow.
Great. Anybody else?
It seems like a very individual.
Yeah, we were talking. We're
Yeah.
sorry, Larry. What did you ask?
The question is, what can you tell me that you derived from this text about the relationship between parent and child in studying Torah?
It seems like an individual responsibility.
Individual responsibility, okay? There is really a serious responsibility here for parent and child. The best way for a child to learn is from parents. Now, where's the provision for school here? So school is obviously a concession, right? Not all parents have either the time or the knowledge to be able to transmit knowledge to their children, and so we have the institution of schools to help us out. Rabbi Beryl Wein has famously said that Jewish children are intrinsically the brightest, most perceptive, sharpest, cleverest, cutest, most wonderful beings on earth. And then we send them to school. Because school obviously has as its rubric, right, a kind of a homogeneous environment. And it's hard to individualize a school. The best schools now are the ones that actually do take steps to try and combine the individualization together with the mass teaching. But the best way to teach a child is from parent to child. If I already know, and I feel that I've acquitted myself well with Jewish knowledge, and now I arrange for my child's education, have I fulfilled my responsibilities?
No.
Why not?
You need to model.
You need to model.
You need to model, and also, even if you don't have the aptitude to, your kid is, so outstanding that they have more textual knowledge, you have this life experience to share. So you have other things to share, and you want to show that person that this is something you value and you think is important.
Great. So life experience is a very, very important way of transmitting knowledge. As my father always used to tell me, the school of hard knocks. So you probably heard that as well. I didn't know where that school was many, many years until I figured it out. But yes, transmitting life experience is very important. Plus, what does it say if a parent has to keep learning? What kind of commitment have we made to education? Lifelong learning. We are the people who created the concept of lifelong learning. You are never exempt from learning. And some of that learning will be just keeping an open mind and being creative and finding ways to exercise your brain cells and your mind muscles. And some of it will be by, I don't know, reading magazines, reading, philosophical papers, expanding yourself. But some of it will also be finding a way to encourage your own continuing study of Jewish topics, whether it's through magazines or online or courses that you take or books that you read. There are so many different ways, probably more ways today than there have ever been before. One of everybody's most available resources is Rabbi Google. Right? Is there anything in the world that you could put into that you can't put into Google and say Jewish and something and not going to Jewish peanut butter? I don't know, whatever it would be, and you Google it, and you're going to come up with some kind of Jewish perspective that you didn't expect. So it's right there at your fingertips. Sometimes literally at your fingertips, right?
What I think was so interesting was the very last line. You're saying to study, we need to study, but really what they're saying is you need to teach yourself. When you think of teach, you think you're teaching somebody else. But really, you need to continue to teach yourself, which I just thought was an interesting verb, rather than study or learn, to teach.
Great point. Here's the
He's
problem.
commanded to teach himself.
Here's the problem. If I ever become satisfied with where I am, and I say it's not about me, it's about other people who need to study, what I've done essentially is I've created the problem. Because now the person next to me who's a little step down is going to say, well, I've got enough, and the person next to that person is going to say, well, I've got enough, and all the way on down the line, everybody's going to say, well, the people to the right of me, they're way more knowledgeable than I could ever be. The people to the left of me, they're the people who have to study. So if everybody collectively would acknowledge that ongoing lifelong study is something that has value, and of course, one of the problems is that most of us, when we were young, were exposed to study that was not engaging. Today, schools are better, the ways to learn are better, the teachers who are teaching are much more engaging. There are so many ways to get excited about Jewish education today that there's no excuse for somebody to say, well, I'm where I want to be and I don't need to be anymore.
So we were a little bit troubled by this C. Similarly, in every place one finds that study takes precedence over deed, for study brings about deed, however, deed does not bring about study. Because I could see that deed is a very good way to spark study, and I think if we're talking about a current pedagogical method, we are really seeing that actively doing something spurs on the desire for study rather than doing it the other way around. So
What if you do it by rote, which we all
Well, I
know
think
well.
I think that they both are equal, and in equal measure, you need to have a certain amount of deed and a certain amount of study. But to say that study, right, that study brings about deed, but deed does not bring about study. I don't know if that is necessarily what we do.
So we were discussing, we were discussing the same point, and I think what you mentioned about roads, you can do deeds all the time, but the study helps you understand why you're doing that deed. So you can light Shabbos candles because tradition and Rama did it, but do you know really why you're doing it?
Excellent. So the Rambam isn't saying that you should study and not have deeds. What he's saying is, if you have a conflict and it's a question of whether you should take time to study or do the deeds, study comes first, because study is going to enlarge and enhance your ability to do more deeds. So there's this overarching commitment to study. It never replaces deeds. In fact, it's very interesting, because on the one hand, the Rambam is telling us that study is important, and on the other hand, we have a phrase, a very famous phrase, that says, Lo ha-midrash ikar, ela ha-ma'aseh, which means it's not the study that's the essence, but it's what you do. So it's teaching us two different things. And I think this is why you have to bring them together. It's a great point that you raised. On the one hand, pardon me?
We're always now, Asev Nishma was this highest of what we will do, and then we will listen.
So what's the reference? Where does Na'aseh Nishma come from?
When the Jews were at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, they were about to be given the Torah, and God said, this is what's going to be presented. And they said, we will accept it even before we will act on it even before we listen to what the thing is. So that would seem to be sort of an opposite statement.
So we find this conflict, which goes back and forth. Yes, at Mount Sinai, what we said was, we will do, and then we will learn, meaning that we won't condition our deeds on whether we understand it or not. And then the Torah comes along and says, or the Talmud says to us, Lo ha-midrash ikar el ha-ma'aseh. It's not about what you study, because what's the danger? You can be an academic. You can just sit in your ivory tower all day long and study, but you won't ever do it. You won't take what you've learned and put it into action. So we have this ongoing conflict about what to do. And so the answer, obviously, is you have to do both, right? That's the Jewish solution to a problem. By the way, you all know that, right? Why is it that the mezuzah is an angle on the door? Because some rabbis thought it should be this way, and some rabbis thought it should be this way, and the compromise was to put it this way. That's a Jewish solution. So we have both traditions, and it's important to see how they interact with each other. So great point, and good observation. Okay.
Can I ask a
Sure.
question? If you're asked to do a mitzvah, a good deed, and you were supposed to be learning on that deed, which would come first?
It's a great question. So the question on the table is, if you have a situation where you have a choice to learn or to do a mitzvah, which one would you do? There are some answers to this question. What do you think?
I guess I would think about whether the mitzvah could be done at a different time or the study could be done at a different time.
Okay.
And pick a priority. So if the mitzvah was, medical and it was time sensitive, I would probably do the mitzvah and then the study.
Okay.
Well, study is a mitzvah, and they never tell you, there's nothing that says which mitzvah is most important. So I think it's up to the individual.
That's an interesting point. In Pirkei Avot it says, don't treat little mitzvahs in a cavalier way, because you don't ever really know what's the reward of a small mitzvah or a large mitzvah. You don't really know what's a small mitzvah, what's a large mitzvah. Maybe a small mitzvah for one person is a large mitzvah for somebody else.
Well, to go along with that, also the implications of that and how it might, if a mitzvah perhaps is with another person, how that may affect the other person as well. So I would always pick the mitzvah personally, but I don't know what the Talmud would say.
Okay.
I just think that the mitzvahs were designed for us to do actions so that we can have ways to constantly connect to Torah, to Hashem, and we're constantly engaged in them.
So what you've all identified is a dynamic tension that exists in the system. There is both a positive and a negative attached to something that we can call the mimetic tradition. Mimetic tradition means there are things that we do because we've seen other people do them and we mimic them, right? So we do certain things that our parents did. If you stopped and said, why do you do it that way? Why do you cut the onion that way? I don't know, that's why my mother cut onions. I never asked, why is that the way you do it? Right, so there are things like that, and the danger, of course, is that the mimetic tradition can become an unthinking, just simply rote behavior, which is not as high a mitzvah as an informed behavior. So the dynamic interaction here of study and deed is something that has to go on all the time. I just want to take a quick aside. What exactly is a mitzvah? So most people, if you ask people, on the street, they'll tell you it's a good deed. It really comes from the shoresh, the root of, I'll put it this way, of sadeh, all right, which, without vowels, which means to command. But there's another tradition that takes an Aramaic word, which is this, tzavta. Tzavta means a connection. What do you think the connection would be? If you do a mitzvah, you are fulfilling a command. There's a sense of fulfillment there. There's an obligation that you have, and you fulfill that obligation. What would be the significance of a connection? What's being connected?
Two human beings.
Between two human beings. If I do a mitzvah and take care of you, I'm making a connection between us. And we know all Jews are responsible for one another, so I'm cementing that connection. What else?
It's also a connection between you and God.
Connection between the commander and the commandee, right? So every time you do a mitzvah, even if it's a mitzvah that's between two people, you are fulfilling that relationship that God has given you as part of your responsibility to have connections with other people. Now, just as an aside, I'm not really getting into theological issues here tonight. People have different understandings of God and command. We're not really talking about any kind of a perspective of a particular movement, but we're thinking here in terms of religious and philosophical sense of the underpinning of our theological understandings of our relationship to God. So this idea of connection is very important because there are a number of levels of connection. Through God, all Jews connect with every other Jew. We are all part of one organic family, one organic entity. It's very interesting. I'm a little bit of an amateur student of religion and sociology, and I have never found another ethnicity, another group of people that have quite the same sense of connection. I mean, if you're an Irish person, but you live in Peru because somehow your ancestors moved to South America and you ended up in Peru, or if you are a Polish person and you're living in the state of Washington, I mean, there's some ethnic connection there, right? But does anybody say within these ethnicities, we have a responsibility for every other person of our group, wherever they may be and whatever the situation is? There may be, but I don't think it's quite the way we do because we have this sense of connection. And one of the ways in which that connection is manifested is through this idea of mitzvah. There are two basic groups of mitzvot. There are those between people and other people, and there are those between people and God. And they merge, ultimately. It's very interesting that according to the Arizal, the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who was a great Kabbalist who lived in Israel, he said that the first thing a person should say at the beginning of prayer in the morning is, Harini mekapel alai mitzvat aseh shel v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Before I pray to God, I have to say, I accept upon myself the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself. God is saying, basically, I don't want your prayers to me unless you've made peace with your fellow human beings. Unless you can live together as a family, don't come to me first. Right? So it's very interesting how these connections work out. All right, the reason I'm spending this time on this, which is not yet about Pesach, is because everything we've said so far is an underpinning of the Seder and the Haggadah and the transmission of this tradition that we have.
So,
Michelle.
And maybe it's from sensitivity, but I think the connection in the mitzvah is not just between Jews. yes, we have to take care of each other, but we have to take care of the world. And I think when you said the Shema, we're all one. I don't think we're just one people, we're one world. So I think it's both the microcosmic and the greater picture.
There is a microcosm and there's a macrocosm, and there's a particular and there's a universalistic. And we have many things that we're taught in the Talmud about tikkun olam, repairing the world, about darkei shalom, doing things that create peace, that express our responsibility for the world at large. But I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you, we've had this conversation before, that our first responsibility is for our own. In the same way that you would say your responsibility for your own children would come before your responsibility for somebody else's children. Everybody has to accept that responsibility. So we have another area of dynamic tension, that we Jews have responsibility for the world in which we live. We don't live here independently. We have common concerns about our environment and about peace and everything else. And we know that it's a big world there. And we have to take care of our own first, but then we have to go beyond that to the world. By the way, I often talk about the fact that people talk about the world's three great religions, Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And there's billions of Muslims, and there's millions of Christians, and then there's Jews. There's more pagans in the world than there are Jews. So it's kind of a joke when they say the world's three great religions. We are so infinitesimal compared to everybody else that you understand why we've developed over the ages that that we say that we take care of our own first, just because we know that ultimately nobody else takes care of us. So we will take care of our own. And then we go from there when we say, and what is our universal responsibility for the world as well? And look at our own community. We have our Associated, we have Chai, we have a number of agencies. CJE deals with Jewish education, and primarily that's for the Jewish community. But we have Jewish Community Services, Chai. We have a number of agencies and services that try to make Baltimore a better place. So that's a manifestation of what you're saying, Michelle. We certainly have that larger responsibility as well. Okay, on that note, let us turn to the other page you have here, which has at the top Talmud Tractate Pesachim. So now that you know that the Mishnah and the Gemara are the oral law written down, and collectively they represent the Talmud, rabbinic law. So I want to take you to first a look at the Talmud, what the Talmud says about how we fulfill our mitzvah, our responsibility on Pesach night at the Seder. And what you've got at the top half of the page is first the Mishnah, and then the Gemara. And what I'd like you to do is in your pairs, I'd like you to look at this again. And the question that I want you to ask yourselves as you read these two paragraphs, Mishnah and Gemara, is what is the reason for beginning with shame and concluding with praise? You'll see what this means after you've read them. But please take a look at those two paragraphs, discuss them among yourselves. If you have any questions about interpreting or anything, I'll be walking around. You can ask me. But take the next few minutes and let's see what you come up with. Open discussion. A little more active engagement. All right, first thing in the Mishnah. His father instructs him according to the son's intelligence. What does that tell you?
What do you say?
Differentiated education, right? Chanoch lanar al pi darko. You should teach a child according to his or her way, according to their strengths. So it requires a certain individualization, and we're talking now about what's happening at the Passover Seder. So the father is telling the story because the Passover Seder, in some respects, is a recitation of Jewish history. Although I must take a side tour here. Some of you have probably heard me tell this, because I tell it all the time. Avram Infeld was a good friend of mine, and who was the person who started the organization Melitz, tells a story about when he made Aliyah from South Africa, and he went to Israel. And he got to Israel, got to Jerusalem, settled in, and enrolled in the Hebrew University. And he called his father. He tells a story. It's so graphic. This is back when intercontinental, phone lines were not so good. And he had to holler into the phone. He said, "Abba, I'm here in Israel." His father was a secularist, a total secularist. and the kind of person who would eat a sandwich while studying the Talmud on Yom Kippur. You know, that kind of secularism. So he said, I'm enrolled in the Hebrew University. And his father said, what are you studying? And he said, I'm studying Jewish history. And his father yelled back over the phone. He said, Jews don't have history. Jews have memory. It's a very interesting question about what the Seder is all about. What are we teaching? And you'll see it in the language. If you look carefully at the Haggadah, at what you're studying, you'll see that we talk about we were slaves in Egypt. Well, I wasn't a slave in Egypt. But if you're talking about memory, so you're talking about something that's vicarious. That I put myself back there as if I were there. The experience is a very real experience for me. And there's an interesting way of looking at this. You know, for most people, time is linear. What's the expression that we say? Time passes, right? You know, I'm here, and time kind of moves on, right? There's before and there's after. Jewish time is not linear. Jewish time is cyclical. And there's a famous author, Rabbi Dessler, who wrote a very important set of books called Michtav Eliyahu, the letters from Eliyahu. He was a rabbi in Israel, a great thinker. And he said, here's the difference. You can have a train that starts in one place and it goes to another place. And that's one kind of train. But then there's a train that has a route. It starts here at the train station, and it goes around, and it comes back to the train station. When it comes back to the train station, is it in a different place or the same place that it started? Same place, different time. And he said that's the way Jewish time works. So that when we get to Passover, Pesach, and we're here, we're in the same place that we were 3,300 years ago when the Pesach story happened. The only difference is it's another year. But it's not linear. It's not like we have this commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt. It's that we re-experience the Exodus from Egypt because that's the only time when you could do it. You can't buy a magazine on the track. You can only buy a magazine in the train station. And so Rabbi Dessler says cyclical time is why we talk about having memories. Memories which are reignited. You can't celebrate Rosh Hashanah a week later. Because that 24 or 48-hour period, that's Rosh Hashanah. You can't have Yom Kippur in the summer. Because the time for atonement is on that day. When on Rosh Hashanah we say, Hayom Harat Olam, this is the birthday of the world, we don't mean this is the birthday, like, oh wow, it's the 5776th birthday of the world. We mean this is the birthday of the world. The world is being reborn, right? It goes a whole year cycle, and then it's reborn again. So that's the idea of cyclical time. So when you're sitting at the Seder and you're telling the story to your children, and you're saying, because of this, or this is what God did to my forefathers, or this is what God did to us, or this is what we experienced in Egypt, what you're saying is, we are celebrating something in a very special, vicarious way, which involves memory much more than history. But in any event, one has to adapt to the child's ability to learn. And then it says, he commences with shame and concludes with praise. Okay, so praise we know is very clear. That's the Hallel that we say. Half of the Hallel is said before the meal, and half of the Hallel is said after the meal. And then it says he expounds from an Aramean, Laban wanted to destroy my father, Yaakov. This story is from the story of Genesis. Laban, or Laban, who was the father-in-law of Yaakov, tricked him into marrying Leah, and then allowed him to marry Rivka, Rachel rather, sorry, and would have probably assimilated Yaakov and his whole family and his children into his way of life. And so the Talmud, the Mishnah, accounts it to Laban as if he was like one of the first enemies of the Jews. And it's by just by the luck of God intervening that Yaakov was able to escape. So we say that would be the shame. But it turns out that we don't actually tell the story from there. And in the Gemara gives us two different views as to where we start the story from. But before we look at that, I just want to ask you one question. What does the Mishnah have in mind here when it says we should start telling the story from the perspective of shame. I mean, what people starts their epic tale with a story of shame? What kind of way is that for us to instill honor and respect in our children? Barbara?
I don't know if it has anything to do with it, but if you start a story with you're bad, you're shameful, things are terrible, and then you take the story all the way through, by the time you're done with the story, you're happy and you're fulfilled and you understand and you imprint it better when you're happy than when someone's yelling.
Good, so part of what you're saying is there's
the
merit in
cadence
showing
of the story,
contrast.
yeah.
Showing contrast from here to there. Yes?
I think people always pay attention more when something's bad.
That's terrible.
I mean, if you're telling a story, like, you know, and you're starting off with something good or something bad, if you hear the bad thing, they'll pay attention.
It was a dark
So,
and stormy night.
you know, and it's, you know, so in a way, the way it was written, how God is written, you're starting off with something that everyone pays attention to in the beginning.
What
Because
else?
hopefully it'll get better from there.
This is great. Think about politics today.
Do we have to?
No, you don't have to. I just want you to know, in your honor, tonight has been designated Super Tuesday. Because you are here, that this is Super Tuesday.
You can't appreciate the good until you've experienced bad, though, as well, because just like if you always felt great, then you just think that's just the way it is. But once you get a cold and you feel miserable, and then the cold goes away and you feel good again, you really appreciate the feeling good again for a while until you've gotten so used to it and you need to get sick again to just appreciate
Why am I
it.
saying that right now? If I could take one deep breath right now without coughing, I would appreciate it so much. Let's see if I remember that at the end of the week when I'm feeling a little bit
And I
better.
think it's just like the movies we watch, once we get engrossed in, we get, whether it's a novella or a novel, it starts this way and then you end up being happy at the end, it becomes a bestseller.
Okay, yes?
We were discussing over here that it kind of gives you like humble beginnings, like know where you come from. Michael was saying, you know, we had the Holocaust that was devastating to our Jewish people, and then we have the state of Israel. And that's something we take extreme pride. Israelis are the smartest, the bestest, they do it most efficient with the least money type thing, but know where you come from. Gives you perspective and it grounds you.
Great, so I think that's a very, very good observation. Humility adds to credibility, right? And that's one of the reasons why I said think of politics today.
Yeah.
You know, if someone never has a shred of humility in the way he or she presents themselves, then how much credibility do they have? Yes? Yes. Humility and shame are not the same thing. I think here, the shame that the mission is referring to is kind of a personal shame. It's the idea that, wow, I would have rather told you that I come from some, you know, wonderful background, and yet I'm a little bit ashamed to tell you that my background is humble, it's plain, or that there was something that I might not have even existed. I could have been non-existent. Those of you, there are a few people here who are in our Leadership 2.0 class with Melton, and we had a conversation in the last class about the difference between King Saul and King David. King Saul was the first king of the Jewish people, and he had all the promise in the world. He had pedigree, he had wealth, he had royalty, even though he was the first king. But he came from a family that was a perfectly wonderful family. King David came from very humble roots. He was a shepherd, right? King Saul had a downfall that was unexpected, and King David was the one who filled his place and then gave rise to the Davidic dynasty, even to the point where we say the Messiah will be a descendant of King David. Why?
He certainly did some shameful things
King
at
David?
the end, King David.
So we don't know how to explain those things. There are some things, but the rabbis seem to give King David a pass. Even though he sinned, he acknowledged his sins. King Saul, apparently, as we understand it, just got a little bit too full of himself. And so the rabbis tell us that everybody should have a bag of bones, which is another expression for skeleton in the closet, right? King David could never forget the fact that he came from humble beginnings, because the people would remind him that he came from humble beginnings. And so he was destined for greatness because he never forgot that. King Saul, his greatness as king kind of went to his head. And so his reign did not last. And we don't have the Saulic dynasty, we have the Davidic dynasty. So we see here that this idea of starting from shame has a combination of contrast, of moving on up, of the idea of humility. All of these things come together. Good. So let's take a look at the Gemara now. The Gemara takes the Mishnah and explains it a little bit deeper. And it says that a person, if the son is intelligent, the son asks him. And if the son is not intelligent, or if there is no son, his wife should ask him. Because the issue here is not whether the son asks, the issue really is the question has to be asked. Right? The Seder is built on questions and answers. So we assign the responsibility to the son to ask, or it could be a daughter. But someone should be asking. And what if the person has no wife? He has to read it out loud. If a person sits down to a Seder on Pesach all by himself, and he just sort of reads the lines with his eyes and he doesn't say the question, hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. Because the questions have to be asked. And even if two scholars who are very well versed in the mitzvah of the Pesach are studying together, they have to ask. Why? Why do two scholars have to ask each other? What's to be gained from that?
They have to connect with each other.
They have to connect with each other. What are they connecting?
With the story.
Your heritage.
Heritage, the story. You grow through asking questions. I have to tell you that there's a terrible tradition that I heard when I was growing up in the 50s, over and over and over and over again, that when my parents' generation was growing up in this country and they would ask questions, the general response was, don't ask questions. We just do things, we don't ask questions. That is so anti-Jewish. Our Jewish tradition is replete with asking questions. That's how the whole Seder is structured, with asking questions and answering them. So two scholars who are studying together, who are celebrating the Seder together, have the same obligation to ask these questions, to go through this process as anybody else. Then, the Gemara says, he commences with shame and concludes with praise. Now here, the Gemara says, what is the shame? What is the shame? And we have two views. One is Rav, and the other is Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel were contemporaries, and much of the Talmud records the discussions between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said, in the beginning our ancestors served idols, and you see, if you look down below, you'll see the language that's in the Haggadah that we're going to look at. We served idols, but now the omnipresent one has brought us close to his service, okay? And Shmuel said, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Right? What's the difference between Rav's view and Shmuel's view?
Well, one we brought upon ourselves, we actively participated in, and the second one, it was thrust upon us. We didn't choose to be slaves.
Great. Great. It's either something that you recognize that's intrinsic within you, or something that is forced upon you. And so each one of them says, which one of these do I think is the more important starting point for the story, and they have different views. What else might you say? Rena?
One says that our ancestors served the idols, and the other talks about that we were the slaves. So one is just referring to back history almost, and the other puts him or herself in the place of being the slaves.
Very good. Very good observation. What else? There's more. All right. Well, you know what? Maybe we'll encounter a little bit more when we look at the Haggadah text itself. Let's just look for a minute at Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman at the end of the Gemara says, he asked his servant Daru, when a master liberates his slave and gives him gold and silver, what should he say to him? And Daru responded, he should say thanks and praise him, replied he. So who's the master and who's the slave here?
Good question.
We interpreted that both ways.
Yeah?
So when it said, what should he say to him? We said, is he slave or is he the master? And the same thing we say to him. So we interpreted what should, you can interpret it, what should the slave say to him, the master? I mean, thanks a lot for letting me go. On the other hand, what should he, the master, say to the slave? And he should thank him for allowing him to do that deed of letting him go. It's like when we're talking about giving charity. Sometimes you always feel better giving than taking.
Very good. So the use of the term slave here is really being borrowed from the story of what happened in Egypt. But when we're talking, what Rav Nachman is really talking about is a servant, okay? Because Jews weren't allowed to have slaves, they had servants. But what's the relevance to this slave-master relationship? Why is the question here? What does it have to do with the Seder and the Pesach story?
That's a good point, too.
Who's the master and who's the slave?
The father and the son.
I hear a couple different answers, father and son and their relationship.
Slaves in Egypt.
Slaves in Egypt.
Jewish people.
So at a first reading, you might be tempted to say, well, the master is Pharaoh, and the slaves are the Jews. But nowhere is there a tradition that says we should say thank you to Pharaoh. Although there is a tradition about recognizing that even though it was servitude, even though it was harsh, that we should recognize that we were strangers in a strange land, and we don't disparage Egypt in that respect, recognizing that we did live there. So the master and the slave here is that we, go ahead.
Well, maybe it has to do with practicing, again, between the person and God. And what you had asked before about the ancestors and the idols, there was they didn't believe in God at that point. They were serving idols. And the second part, when it says we were slaves to Pharaoh, at that point they were already, even though they didn't have the Torah, they were still considered a people of Jacob, a Jewish nation.
Good.
So maybe the master would be God giving you the Torah and you giving praise for having it to study.
Good, very good. Come back to the original question in the Mishnah and also in the Gemara, which says that we should start from shame and end with praise. So the discussion that the rabbis had was which one of the phrases, which one of the parts of the Torah should we use to describe the shame? And then all of a sudden it talks about the master and the slave, and the slave responds he should thank and praise him. Does that add any suggestion as to why it's here?
We should value our suffering, because we have the opportunity to learn from it and grow.
That's interesting. I think that we should value negative experiences we have, especially when we can learn from them. I think it's the fulfillment now of the Mishnah saying you start with shame. And there are two sources we can use to describe our shame, whether it's that we were idol worshippers or that we were almost destroyed by Jacob's father-in-law. And then we end with praise, which is Hallel. The master in this case is God, who effectuated the release of the slaves, which was us in Egypt. So that's why we end with Hallel. That's why we end with praise. Because a slave who's released by his master should praise the master. Say, thank you for letting me go. So in this instance, what we're saying is the Egyptians didn't let us go because all of a sudden they thought, oh, you know what, it's probably a good idea to let 3 million people go from our country. Let's destroy our economy. Let's let all these people who've been working for us for nothing, let's let them go. Right? Why did we go? We went because there were 10 plagues, because God killed the firstborn, because God took us out. Right? So the reference here is we should thank and praise God because he was the master who liberated the slaves from Egypt. So again, what we're doing here in the story is we're ascribing responsibility not to ourselves and our might. We didn't war against the Egyptians. We didn't have the ability to do that. we were suddenly delivered in a chipazon, in an instant, right? That's why our matzah didn't rise, because we had to leave in a hurry. Okay, you've now seen what the Mishnah and the Gemara say. Let's take our last section of text to look at, and it's from the Haggadah itself of Pesach. Now, this part that we're talking about, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, comes after the child asks the 4 questions of the father or whoever is running the Seder, right? And the interesting thing is, what kind of questions does the child ask? Why is this night different? Why do we eat bitter herbs? Why do we eat matzah? Why do we lean? Right? Why do we dip? Right? But the answer that follows it does not say we eat matzah because of this, or we eat bitter herbs because of this. Those answers, some of them remain unanswered, and you have to infer it, and some of them come way, way, way at the end of the Haggadah, of the first part of the Haggadah, before we eat the meat. So it's very interesting. We have to be patient to get to these answers. The Haggadah itself doesn't give us the direct answers, but it does start us off describing our memory. All right? So what you have here is the 2 paragraphs you have, there's dot, dot, dot in between them. I think that's what they call ellipsis.
Yes.
Good. Because these 2 paragraphs don't follow each other. In fact, you have in your packet, Connie, you have it out, there's 3 pages taken from a regular Haggadah that shows you what the relationship is. On page 1, you have the first of these paragraphs. It's not until page 3 that you have the second one. And you're going to see that these 2 paragraphs mirror the 2 views of Rav and Shmuel as they were described in the Gemara. That's how the Haggadah knows what it should say. So what I'd like you to do is take the next 5 minutes, read through these 2 paragraphs, and what I want you to do is ask yourself a couple questions. Why is Shmuel's version first before Rav's? And what is the difference between them? As we said, we're going to come back to that question. And why is this used as the beginning of the mitzvah to tell the Pesach story? Is there a philosophical difference between them? Is there a pragmatic difference between them? And remember, you've got your reflection sheet, which also in your packet, which gives you a couple of these questions that we've been addressing, either directly or indirectly, that you might want to take a look at as you're going through this as well. So please read those 2 paragraphs. You have to read them very, very carefully. I'd like you to either circle or underline any phrase that you think is either inconsistent or that stands out, something that you think might be noteworthy. So you might want to mark up your text here. The first paragraph, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt.
Yes.
Whose view is that?
Shmuel.
Shmuel. That is the view of Shmuel. And the second paragraph, in the beginning our ancestors served idols? Rav. So the Avadim Hayinu paragraph with which we begin our answer goes according to Shmuel, not according to Rav. Rav comes 3 pages later, right? You saw that in the Haggadah. Why do we start with Shmuel's answer? Why didn't we start with Rav's answer? Rav comes first in the Gemara. So give me some reasons why you think Shmuel's answer is a more compelling answer to start the answer to the child than Rav's. Barbara?
Well, it seemed to us that the sentencing we're talking about, even if we were intelligent, and even if we all understood that it's our obligation every year to tell this story. And so, to us, that was sort of the whole purpose of why we're here tonight. So here's the questions. This is what we got to do, so listen up carefully.
Okay.
And this was kind of the beginning. And Rav's happened after we left Egypt. This is after we left Egypt, we're getting ready to go to the Promised Land, and there's Joshua getting up to talk to us and sort of affirming that there's one God. That belongs later on in the story.
Actually, that's the way it seems.
It does.
But actually, Rav is referring to the time of Abraham. And it was Abraham's father. Remember the story about the idol shop?
Yeah.
So in the beginning, our ancestors served idols, says that Abraham descended from idol worshippers. Now, the proof text that's brought is a reference where Joshua said to the people, "Thus said the Lord of God Israel, your fathers used to live on the other side of the river," meaning, don't forget where you come from. You come from the other side of the tracks. Terach, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. So actually, in time, the second paragraph goes back before the first paragraph.
Right, but isn't it because Joshua said to the people?
Right. So Joshua is the one bringing the proof text of this point.
Right.
But it's not from Joshua's time.
No, I know that.
Oh, okay.
I know you're saying
Okay.
that's later on, but the Exodus is after, is Joshua's time.
Right. Joshua was part of the Exodus,
Right.
and then he carried on after Moses. Good. Judy.
Could it be significant that Shmuel's piece says, we were slaves? Is that more compelling than your ancestors? That's somebody else. I mean, they are our ancestors, but we were slaves.
Great. So I think and that answer came back in the back as well. That it's more personal, and it relates to the concept of memory. Right? Whereas the second paragraph, Rav's is more about history, and Shmuel's is more about memory. It's vicarious. We were slaves. Michael?
So this frames it as the birth of the Jewish people. Pesach is the birth of the Jewish people. Before, we were a big family that went down, which is interesting, but the people itself was born here, and that's what we're talking about. If we were not born as a people, we'd be Egyptians, or we'd be something else, but we would not be Jews. So it grabs your attention. This is what we're going to be talking about, the birth of Jewish people. Why? And Rav gives the why. What happened? And the reason God redeemed us is because he promised our forefathers, our ancestors. So why did he promise them? Because they stuck their neck out and they went against the grain of the whole world, which was doing whatever they were doing, worshiping idols, did not recognize the Creator, did not recognize God. And they said, no, that's not the way it is, that's not the way of the world. And God said afterwards, it's not in here, but he said, you're going to go down, you're going to be slaves, and then I'm going to take you out. He kept his promise. But what's really important for us to know is not that God keeps his promises. We were born. And we were born because he keeps his promises, because our ancestors really were great people and did great things.
Good. Interesting question, by the way. What were we when we came down into Egypt from Canaan? We came down to 70 souls, 12 tribes, the children of Jacob. What were we at that time?
Family.
A family. We were a clan. We were an extended family. We still have clans like that in Israel today among the Arabs. I remember when we had our partnership with Carmiel and Misgav, we visited Arab villages in the Misgav region where there's 3 families in the entire town, just extended families. And that's what we were. We were an extended family. What were we when we left Egypt? A nation. When did we consecrate that nationhood?
That's the difference between Breshit and Shemot.
Right.
One's families, and the second book of the Torah is about nationhood.
Very good, very good. And so we start as a nation when we leave Egypt. When is that nationhood consecrated? At Mount Sinai. Why? Because then that's the encounter between people and divinity. And that's what instills within us this everlasting nationhood. Sandy, do you have an idea?
Well, I was just thinking now, which is the people who worship idols, who served idols, they did that themselves. But when they became slaves, that was at somebody else's hand that made them slaves. And so they're really 2 very different kinds of slavery.
Right. Both of which talk about the dynamic relationship between a person and his or her environment. Right? Are we slaves today? In what way are we slaves?
To Egypt.
Slaves to our technology, right? We are definitely slaves to our technology. We're slaves to our busy lives, right? Sometimes we're slaves to our desire to acquire more. There are all kinds of slavery. Slaves to our wanting to please other people sometimes at the expense of telling the truth. Right? So there's all kinds of slavery, and there's always some kind of opportunity for you to release yourself from slavery. And your interaction with the environment is an important part of that. There were a couple of other observations? Leah?
I was just thinking that perhaps the reason that we use Shmuel's suggestion is because this is really an answer, so to speak, to the Manish Tana, why is this night different from all other nights? The answer that why is this night different is the story of coming out of Egypt. That's the overriding answer to why is this night different. I think perhaps that's why we start with the story of coming out of Egypt, instead of starting with we were idols.
Great. Perfect. I would like to suggest one other possibility. If you look carefully at Shmuel, which is the first paragraph, it's talking about a kind of redemption. In fact, Rav is also talking about a kind of redemption. Shmuel's redemption is getting out of Egypt. What kind of redemption is that? It's a physical redemption. Rav is talking about not serving idols and learning to serve God. What kind of redemption is that? Spiritual redemption. Wouldn't you have expected the spiritual redemption to come first before the physical redemption?
It's harder to understand the spiritual than the physical.
Say it again?
It's harder to understand the spiritual than the physical.
Okay, good. So if this is an answer to a child asking questions, maybe the physical redemption has more meaningfulness to the child, right? It's easier for the child to identify with that.
But it's like studying deed. It's the same concept.
Good.
Physical is deed.
Like taking care of yourself before you take care of your child, right? These things all kind of line up in the end. Spiritual redemption is important, but first you need to take care of yourself and make sure you're able to be spiritual, right? If I had a choice between taking care of my physical needs and my spiritual needs, maybe I should take care of my physical needs, because if I don't take care of my physical needs, I won't be around to exercise my spiritual needs. So children relate to that. The Rambam says that the Seder has two aspects. Shmuel is telling us about the story we tell our children or the child within us, and Rav is telling us a story as presented to a mature adult. So children can better understand the drama of slavery, freedom, miracles, Star Wars, right? You know, something dramatic. Special effects. What special effects? Those plagues? Those were the first special effects, right? While adults can understand the more subtle aspects of the journey from polytheism to monotheism, from myth to faith, from an extended family to a new nation. So that might be one explanation as to why we start with Shmuel first, and then with Rav. Another way of looking at it would be to say that Shmuel focuses on, as some of you said, the immediate aspect of the event of the Exodus from Egypt, slavery and redemption, which is what I was just referring to. All of us have this ongoing annual opportunity to think about moving ourselves from slavery to redemption. Just like on Rosh Hashanah, I have the opportunity to think about the world being reborn. And then I can be reborn. I can atone for my sins between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I can start fresh. So too, on Pesach, there's an opportunity for me to think about what are the things that enslaved me. What would it take for me to think about redeeming myself from slavery, to free myself up to accomplish the things that I'm not allowing myself to accomplish? I want to take in the few minutes we have left, just take a look again at we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That is Avad and Hanini. That's that first paragraph after the questions. And I want to do rapid fire. I want to ask you 5 questions, and you got to come up with quick answers, okay? Question number 1. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Where else could we have been slaves to Pharaoh? It's redundant. Why does it have to say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt? It just should have said we were slaves to Pharaoh. We know that Pharaoh was in Egypt.
Why?
What does it teach us?
You can be slave in your mind.
You could be a slave in your mind. That is one of the kinds of redemption that we all should be looking for in Pesach.
Details matter.
Details matter, okay. Details matter, but our sages are typically very Spartan when it comes to adding details that are unnecessary. So the premise here is that if it says we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, there must be some reason why Egypt is mentioned as well as Pharaoh.
Because we want to focus on our homeland? I mean, our specific
Contrast.
place?
Proximity
You know,
to
remember, remember Israel, you know, because you want to remember this is where ultimately.
So Israel's our homeland in contrast to Egypt, which was not our
our
homeland.
slavery.
Very good. Very good. I think it's also useful to know that the following answers I'm going to give you are all taken from the commentary of the Malbim, Rabbi Meir Libush Malbim, who was a rabbi around the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s. He lived in all over Europe and wrote, among other things, commentary on the Haggadah. So he said that Pharaoh was a tyrannical ruler and Egypt was a tyrannical regime. It was two different aspects of the slavery that we had. The word Mitzrayim, which means Egypt, can also be pronounced Meitzarim, which means oppression. So the very country, the very nature of Egypt was a country of oppression. It was a whole nation of oppressors, not just Pharaoh. So it's kind of like in Germany, right? All these innocent people who said, "I didn't know what was going on."
I just said that.
How do you like that?
We just said that.
Great minds. So in Egypt, the Egyptians couldn't say we didn't know what was going on because we know, the Midrash tells us of the kinds of oppression that the Jewish people were subjected to. So it wasn't just Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a tyrant, and Egypt was a tyrannical regime.
And it wasn't just Pharaoh who was being. I mean, he had all. When Pharaoh wasn't the one doing the slavery, it went throughout Egypt. All the Egyptians.
Very good. And we know this because it would have been patently unfair for the Egyptians to have to suffer all these plagues if it had only been Pharaoh. Much of the story focuses on Pharaoh and his hard heart and his resistance to let the people go. But in addition to Pharaoh, it was the Egyptian civilization. Why did we have to go through that, by the way? Why was it so important for the Jews to experience slavery and oppression in Egypt? I mean, there must be a reason for it. What theological reason can you ascribe to it?
So they should appreciate freedom.
Makes you appreciate freedom
And choice.
Makes you treat the oppressed differently because you experience that.
So it
yourself.
became part of our DNA, right? We are always at the front of almost any progressive movement. Because we learned early on in our building of our nation, you don't oppress other people. You may have a situation in which an individual needs to be punished, but you don't oppress people. And I think that this becomes a very controversial issue in terms of the Middle East today. But those who are fair-minded, and look objectively, as many people have said today, Israel should be held to a high standard, but not a higher standard than everybody else, right? There should be some relative relationship here, but the fact of the matter is that Israel can hold its own among the countries in the world, even with the problems that are inherent there, that it is not a country of oppression. There's no apartheid per se as you have in other countries. So we learned by our being in Egypt that it was very important not to be an oppressive people. Question number 2. It says, God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. I always wondered about this. Why do we need both expressions? Couldn't it have just said, God took us out with a strong hand, or God took us out with an outstretched arm? What I told you before was that the rabbis didn't use extra words if they didn't need to. So there must be some distinction between them. What do you think is the difference between a strong hand and an outstretched arm?
Strength and compassion.
Strength and compassion.
Yep.
Excellent.
Tough love versus
Tough love? There's love, but there's tough love. Good. What else?
I think it was a visual, like the strong hand is strength and the outstretched arm is length. So that it's all encompassing.
So strong hand can be like this, right? The outstretched arm is like this. But I like that. But what does that tell you? What do they do? What does the outstretched arm do to the strong hand?
Gathers everyone in.
It's encompassing. Very good.
I told you. I made you go to TV.
So the Malbim says, with a strong hand he punished the Egyptians for their evil, and with an outstretched arm he revealed himself through the plague so that there could be no doubt that it was through his intervention. In other words, God made it clear that the Egyptians could not explain all this away by, the atmospheric conditions changed, and there was a low tide with the Red Sea, right? God made it very clear that he was the master, that he was punishing the Egyptians, and that it was him that he was the one intervening. Other nations have multiple gods, each with a specific mission or ability, but our monotheistic faith recognizes one God who does it all, the strong hand and the outstretched arm. I really, really like the explanation that suggests that the strong hand is the hand that does battle with the Egyptians, and the outstretched arm is what encompasses us and sort of whisks us away. So I like that answer. Question number 3. Why repeat the reference to the Holy One, blessed be He? If you read, it says, the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Why didn't it just say, if He? We already referred to Him as Lord and God. The two main names, Hashem and Elohim. Why does it have to say the Holy One, blessed be He?
Blessed is He.
The Holy, I think, when you say the Holy One, you're referring to about God, but then blessed be He is saying thank you, like it's like talking, like thank you, kind of like.
It's like Baruch Atah, right?
Yeah.
Blessed are you, O Lord our God.
So the first one, the Holy One, you're talking about who had taken us out, and then thank God that He had done that. So yeah.
Good.
It's almost like what you said before with the two different answers, the physical and the spiritual. So the first one, the Lord our God, is more of like a physical, and then the Holy One, blessed be He, is more of the spiritual.
In referring to God as holy, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed is He. Who else is holy? We are, right? The Torah says, Kadosh to you, you shall be holy. What does that mean? What are we establishing here?
Connected.
A relationship. A holy God released us from Egypt, and along with that comes the responsibility to be holy. Right? So not only do we move from being a family and a clan to being a nation, but we aspire now to mimic God, imitat Diodeh. We have to try and be godly. That's part of our responsibility as the Jewish people. So if God is holy, if He's the Holy One, blessed be He, then we have to be holy ones as well. And lastly, no, not lastly, next to last. Why do we mention that we would still be subjugated to Pharaoh in Egypt? It's been 3,300 years since then. Right? Do you really think that we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt if he had not taken our fathers? I mean, there's 3,300 years of history. All sorts of things could have happened. What does that expression mean? It's always troubled me. Judy, it's on the tip of your tongue.
Perhaps we would have disappeared had we not been brought out of Egypt. We would have just merged into Egypt and lost our identity.
Actually, our tradition tells us that there are 49 different levels, 50 levels of impurity, and that we had reached the 49th level of impurity. Not that we were terrible, but we had just become so assimilated into the Egyptian society that had we been there one more moment, we would have been totally assimilated, never would have left. That's why we celebrate the fact that the people left in a hurry, right? The idea of the matzah tells us we left in a hurry because if we didn't leave, we were about to be swallowed up. So perhaps this idea of our liberation from bondage, that obligates us and inspires us to higher levels of gratitude for the fact that we weren't swallowed up. We avoided all of the temptations of assimilation. And I think that's one of our challenges today. The ravages of assimilation are very heavy on us today. We're having a very hard time trying to find ways to avoid all those forces that would otherwise, for the first time in history perhaps, we can actually blend in. We don't have to wear any special clothing. We don't have to wear a star. We don't have to wear a special hat, although some of us do. We don't, but it's entirely possible for a Jew. I mean, you could be Bernie Sanders, some Jew, but you can aspire to the highest things that anybody else can achieve in this country, and that's good. The downside of it is that the temptation to just blend in works against the idea of maintaining our own identity. So maybe that's what the text is telling us. That had it been one more moment, we would have been swallowed up. And that's something that we've confronted throughout our history. Last question. The paragraph ends, and it says, I'm sorry, not ends, but it says the text switches from the first person when it says we to the third person plural. First person plural to third person plural in the middle of the paragraph. First it says, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm. And then it said, the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our fathers. It should have said us. Why did it change from first person to third person? So I think we've talked about it before already, that this is part of the ongoing connection of realizing that we are them and they are we, and the timelessness of this lesson. That from every generation, the whole door of a door, every generation has to look at this text and has to figure out, how does this apply to us? How did it apply to our forefathers? How will it apply to our children? And we have to pass it on. The opportunity to take a close look like this, a text, and to realize how much is implied, how much of our culture that we know as Jews emanates from these texts, is something that we only get to when we study together. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, for being a partner with CJE and the Associated in Leadership Learning. Just to remind you that we have 2 more sessions. I can tell you that the 2 educators we have for those 2 sessions are both going to be fantastic. Please remember that in your packet is the reflection sheet. And we touched on, I think, almost everything that's referred to there. Would love to have your ideas. So if you'd rather not fill it out tonight, but maybe jot down a couple of notes while they're fresh in your mind. And we're going to send you the link if you'd like to do it online. But if you do want to spend a couple of minutes writing them down, share them with us here. For any other thoughts, by the way, if you have thoughts about tonight's presentation, what you liked, what you didn't like, you can share those with us as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the 15th. Thank you.